The soldier crouched low in the desert sand, heart pounding. His throat was dry, his hands shaking. He could hear the distant rumble of trucks, the sound of boots crunching through the heat, but there was no escape. He had only a few moments. He could feel the hot air against his skin, the sting of sweat dripping down his face. He could almost smell the dust, thick and choking. Then, he heard a voice, a sharp whisper, so close it made him freeze. "Stay quiet," the voice ordered. "We'll wait for the signal." His mind raced. He knew what this meant. The signal would come soon, too soon. And when it did, the battle would begin. But who would win? Who would survive? Who was on his side? He didn't know. He didn't trust anyone. He was just a pawn in someone else's game. A game played by people who didn't care about the lives of soldiers like him. The soldier's eyes flickered to his comrades, all tense, all waiting for that one command that would change everything. The tension in the air was thick, like the weight of the world itself was resting on their shoulders. And just as the silence reached its peak, the signal came. The explosion shook the ground. He felt the heat, he heard the gunfire, and then it all blurred together. He had no choice but to run. He didn't know what was happening around him, but he knew this. The promise they'd been given was a lie. The hope they'd held onto was a cruel joke. And in that moment, he realized. He was fighting a war that wasn't his. His future wasn't his to decide. And the betrayal, it was as deep as the desert sand. Let's rewind a little bit. How did we get here? It wasn't always like this. The Middle East, with its rich lands and ancient history, was once a place of trade and culture, a region that connected the East and West. But as the 20th century rolled in, things began to change. Powerful nations in Europe began to set their sights on the area, not for its beauty or its history, but for its resources. Oil, land, power. The Ottoman Empire had been the ruling force in the region for centuries, but by the early 1900s, the empire was crumbling. The First World War came, and the Ottoman Empire fell. That's when the British and the French saw their chance. They started to make promises to the Arabs, promising independence, land, and freedom in exchange for their help during the war. But here's the thing. These promises, they were never meant to be kept. The British and the French made secret deals with each other. They decided how to split the region, carving it up like a pie. They didn't care about the Arabs' dreams of freedom. They just cared about what they could get: oil, control, and power. The Arabs were left in the dark. They had trusted the British and the French. They believed that after the war, they would get their independence. But instead, Britain and France broke those promises. To make matters worse, there were leaders, Arab leaders like Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who believed in those promises. They fought beside the British and the French, hoping for a better future. But the reality was far different. When the war ended, instead of gaining freedom, the Arabs found themselves under the control of European powers. The British took control of Palestine, Iraq, and Jordan. The French took Syria and Lebanon. They divided the region into artificial borders, ignoring the people who lived there. They didn't care about the tribes, the cultures, the religions. They cared about power and resources. And the Arabs? They were left to pick up the pieces of their broken promises. This betrayal? It's the spark that started the conflict we see in the Middle East today. It was the beginning of a long, painful road. One filled with anger, with distrust, with wars that would last for generations. And it all started with a simple lie: the promise of freedom. The Arabs had been promised freedom, but what they got was oppression. Their hopes were crushed by the sharp, cold reality of European control. But then, everything changed. In the 1920s, as the British and French tightened their grip on the region, something unexpected began to stir. The Arabs had been betrayed, but now they were angry. They wanted more. They weren't going to sit quietly anymore. They began to resist. But the problem was, they were divided. The leaders couldn't agree on a single course of action. Some were loyal to the British and French, believing that they had to play by their rules to secure some form of self-determination. Others felt they had been sold out, and they began to take action in a desperate bid for independence. But just when it seemed like there was a chance for unity, another twist emerged. The British and French were no longer the only players. The rise of nationalist movements in the region began to threaten the control of the colonial powers. And then, there was the discovery of oil. The oil underneath the sands of the Middle East had always been there. But it wasn't until the 1920s that the Europeans realized just how valuable it was. Now, oil became the lifeblood of the region, and both Britain and France couldn't afford to lose control over it. The Arabs knew they were sitting on a treasure, but they had no say in how it was used. Their oil, their land, their future. It was all being taken by foreign powers who had no interest in their well-being. The promises of independence and freedom had been shattered, and now, the Arabs saw that they were nothing more than pawns in a game played by the world's strongest nations. And while Britain and France divided the spoils, the United States was watching, quietly biding its time. The US was slowly gaining power, and they had their eyes set on the Middle East, too. The world was changing fast, and the balance of power was shifting. But then everything changed again. The discovery of oil wasn't just a blessing, it was a curse. It made the Middle East even more valuable, but it also made it even more dangerous. The Middle East had always been a battleground for empires, but now it was a battleground for control over the most valuable resource in the world. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, when it seemed like war was inevitable, the British and the French made one more fatal mistake. They thought they had everything under control, that they could continue to play their game of manipulation. But they didn't count on the one thing they could never control, the anger of the Arab people. In the late 1940s, as the British prepared to withdraw from Palestine, they left behind a land divided, a place where the Arabs and Jews had been fighting for years. The British had promised both sides the same land, and now they were running away from the mess they had created. The result? The birth of Israel, and the beginning of a new, even more dangerous chapter in the Middle East conflict. The Arabs were angry. They had been betrayed by the British, and now they were angry at the world. They saw Israel as a symbol of everything they had lost, a symbol of foreign intervention in their land, a symbol of broken promises. The war that followed was brutal. It wasn't just a war over land. It was a war over dignity, over the right to control their own future. And the anger, the rage, it didn't stop there. The events of 1948 set off a chain reaction that would change the Middle East forever. The Arabs had been betrayed, not just by the British and the French, but by the world, and they weren't going to forget it. It all came to a head in 1956, the Suez Crisis. The world watched as British and French forces, along with Israeli soldiers, launched an invasion of Egypt. The plan? To take control of the Suez Canal, the vital waterway that connected Europe to the Middle East. But this wasn't just about the canal. This was about power. This was about sending a message to the Arabs that Britain and France were still in charge. But the world was changing. The United States, once a silent observer, was now a global superpower, and they weren't happy about what Britain and France were doing. The US had its own interests in the Middle East, and it wasn't about to let the Europeans take control again. The US forced Britain and France to back down. They imposed sanctions, pressured them at the United Nations, and made it clear that the old ways of colonial control were over. The British and French, humiliated and powerless, had no choice but to pull their forces out. For the first time, the US had shown the world that it was the dominant power in the Middle East. But for the Arabs, this wasn't a victory. The Suez Crisis might have been a humiliation for the British and French, but it didn't change the fact that the Middle East was still a battleground for control. The promises made to the Arabs were long forgotten, and the anger and resentment grew stronger. The region was a powder keg, and it only needed a spark to set it off. And that spark came in 1967, when the Six-Day War broke out. The Arabs, still reeling from the betrayal, fought against Israel once again. This time, they were determined to reclaim what they had lost. But the war ended in disaster. Israel defeated the Arab forces in just 6 days, capturing even more territory. The Arabs were humiliated again, and the conflict only deepened. But the US had emerged as the new power in the region, and it wasn't going anywhere. The betrayal of the British and French had left the Arabs in a state of anger and distrust, and that anger would fuel the Middle East conflict for years to come. When the dust finally settled after decades of fighting, the Middle East was forever changed. The Arabs had been promised freedom, but they had been betrayed. The region was divided, and the scars of broken promises ran deep. The conflict didn't end with the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, or any of the other battles that followed. It continued, fed by the anger and betrayal that had started with Britain and France. The lesson? Betrayal has a cost. A broken promise doesn't just go away. It echoes through history, shaping the future. The Middle East conflict didn't begin with one war or one event. It began with a lie. And that lie has been passed down through generations, leaving a trail of anger, pain, and distrust that still haunts the region today. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are the ones caused by the promises we break.